Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. I'm excited to introduce our topic, gas exchange and respiratory gas transport. In this presentation, we'll explore how oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported within the body, focusing on the mechanisms behind these vital processes. We'll cover how gases move across the respiratory membrane and how they are carried through the bloodstream. Let's get started and dive into the fascinating world of respiratory physiology. Today, we're diving into Chapter 9, which focuses on carbon dioxide equilibrium and transport. This is a crucial part of understanding how our respiratory system works to maintain proper gas exchange. As blood picks up carbon dioxide from tissues, it doesn't just carry it back to the lungs randomly. Instead, CO2 exists in a dynamic equilibrium, meaning it balances between different forms in the blood. Most of it is transported as bicarbonate ions, which form through a series of reactions involving water and carbon dioxide. This process is vital because it helps regulate blood pH and ensures efficient removal of CO2. The transport mechanisms are finely tuned, allowing carbon dioxide to be carried in three main forms: dissolved in plasma, bound to hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin, and as bicarbonate ions. Understanding these pathways not only explains how CO2 is removed from our bodies, but also highlights the importance of respiratory and circulatory cooperation. So, as we progress, keep in mind how these processes fit into the bigger picture of respiratory gas transport, which is essential for maintaining homeostasis and supporting cellular function. Let's talk about gas exchange and how it works in living organisms. Gas exchange is the biological process where different gases move in opposite directions across specialized respiratory surfaces. It's absolutely essential for respiration because it allows oxygen to enter the bloodstream and carbon dioxide to be expelled from the body. In humans and many other animals, this process takes place in the lungs, specifically in tiny structures called alveoli. These alveoli provide a large surface area, making gas exchange more efficient. Interestingly, plants also perform gas exchange, but in a slightly different way. During photosynthesis, they take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen, which is vital for life on Earth. The efficiency of this process isn't just about the presence of alveoli or stomata, though. It's influenced by factors like surface area. More surface area means more gas can be exchanged at once, concentration gradients, which drive the movement of gases, and the properties of the respiratory membrane itself. So, understanding how gas exchange works helps us appreciate how organisms meet their oxygen needs and remove waste gases, which ties into the broader theme of how respiratory systems are adapted for survival. Let's talk about gas exchange and how respiratory gases are transported in our body. Oxygen transport is absolutely vital because it involves delivering oxygen from the lungs to all the tissues, where it's needed for cellular function, and at the same time, removing carbon dioxide from those tissues back to the lungs for exhalation. A key player in this process is hemoglobin, the protein found in red blood cells. Hemoglobin binds oxygen in the lungs, where oxygen levels are high, and then releases it in the tissues, where oxygen is more scarce. This binding and releasing process is crucial for maintaining efficient oxygen delivery throughout the body. But the efficiency of this process isn't constant. It's influenced by several factors, including the partial pressure of oxygen, which determines how much oxygen can bind to hemoglobin. Additionally, pH levels, temperature, and the presence of a molecule called 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate can all modify hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen, optimizing oxygen release where it's most needed. Disruptions in oxygen transport can lead to a condition called hypoxia, which simply means that tissues aren't getting enough oxygen, and that can cause serious problems in body function. Understanding these mechanisms is essential for diagnosing and treating respiratory and circulatory disorders, because if we know how oxygen is supposed to move and what can go wrong, we can develop better strategies to help those affected. Now, let's review the key points about oxygen transport. Remember, it's a complex but beautifully coordinated process that's central to our overall health and well-being. let's talk about how gas exchange and respiratory gas transport relate to oxygen and ATP production. Cells need oxygen to produce ATP, which is the energy currency of our body. Think of it as the fuel our cells run on. Without oxygen, they can't generate the energy they require for all their functions. Now, as a byproduct of this process, called aerobic metabolism, our cells produce carbon dioxide, or CO2. This CO2 needs to be removed from the body efficiently, which brings us to the importance of gas exchange in the lungs and across tissues. When metabolism increases, say during exercise, our cells work harder, and naturally, they produce more CO2. This means that the more active we are, the more CO2 we generate, highlighting how closely linked our metabolic activity is to gas production and removal. So, in summary, oxygen intake supports ATP production, and as a result of that process, CO2 is generated and must be transported out of the body. This entire cycle is vital for maintaining our energy levels and overall homeostasis. Now, let's talk about the role of blood flow in CO2 transport. Essentially, blood flow is responsible for carrying CO2 from the body's tissues back to the lungs. This process is crucial because it helps us remove a waste product that, if allowed to build up, could cause problems. The importance of CO2 elimination cannot be overstated. By exhaling, we get rid of CO2, preventing its accumulation in the tissues, which helps maintain the body's pH balance and overall homeostasis. So, in summary, CO2 is a byproduct of metabolism that needs to be efficiently transported via the blood and expelled through respiration. This entire process highlights how our respiratory and circulatory systems work together seamlessly to keep us healthy. So, let's explore the CO2 diffusion gradient between the tissues and the arterial blood. Here, the key point is that the alveolar PCO2 is typically around 40 mmHg, and the arterial PCO2, which we measure as PaCO2, is also about 40 mmHg. This indicates that at rest, the levels of CO2 in the alveoli and arterial blood are in equilibrium, facilitating efficient gas exchange. Remember, the blood carries CO2 from the tissues back to the lungs, where it is ultimately exhaled. The average tissue PCO2, however, is a bit higher, around 46 mmHg, reflecting the CO2 produced by cellular metabolism. Similarly, venous PCO2, measured as PVO2, is also approximately 46 mmHg, showing that the blood returning to the lungs still holds a significant amount of CO2. This entire process is crucial because it maintains the balance of CO2 levels in our body. At rest, the body produces roughly 200 milliliters of CO2 per minute, which needs to be transported and expelled efficiently. Understanding these gradients and transport mechanisms helps us grasp how our respiratory system keeps our blood gases in check and supports overall homeostasis. Now, let's talk about the role of ventilation in regulating PaCO2 and volatile acids. Normally, alveolar ventilation is perfectly matched to the rate at which the tissues produce carbon dioxide. This balance is crucial because it ensures that CO2 is eliminated from the body efficiently. When alveolar ventilation increases, more CO2 is expelled, and when it decreases, CO2 tends to build up. This process helps us maintain a stable partial pressure of alveolar CO2, or PaCO2, as well as arterial PaCO2, both around 40 mmHg. This level is important because it keeps the blood's pH in a normal range, preventing the development of acid-base imbalances. So, in essence, effective ventilation acts like a fine-tuned system to keep our CO2 levels steady, which in turn helps regulate our body's volatile acids and maintain overall respiratory and metabolic balance. This connection is fundamental to understanding how our respiratory system supports homeostasis and responds to different physiological demands. Today, we'll be discussing hypoventilation and its effects on gas exchange. When the rate of CO2 production in the body temporarily exceeds the rate at which CO2 is eliminated through ventilation, we call this hypoventilation. Essentially, the body isn't removing CO2 fast enough, leading to an increase in the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood, known as PaCO2. This imbalance has important consequences for blood pH. Higher PaCO2 levels cause the blood to become more acidic, resulting in a decrease in blood pH. So, hypoventilation can lead to acid-base disturbances, which are critical to understand in the context of respiratory health. Now, let's talk about the role of ventilation in regulating PaCO2 and volatile acids. Ventilation is our body's primary mechanism for removing CO2. When ventilation decreases, as in hypoventilation, the effort required to eliminate CO2 is reduced. This means less CO2 is expelled, and it accumulates in the blood. This accumulation also impacts the alveoli, the tiny air sacs where gas exchange occurs. Due to reduced ventilatory effort, alveolar CO2 levels rise, further contributing to the elevated PaCO2. So overall, hypoventilation results in increased alveolar CO2, which then influences the entire system, affecting blood pH and acid-base balance. Understanding these processes highlights the importance of adequate ventilation in maintaining respiratory and metabolic homeostasis within the body. Now, let's take a closer look at hyperventilation. Hyperventilation occurs when the rate of CO2 elimination by the lungs temporarily exceeds the amount of CO2 produced by the body. Essentially, you're breathing out more CO2 than your body is generating, which can happen during anxiety, stress, or even voluntary hyperventilation. This shift has a direct impact on the levels of PaCO2, or partial pressure of carbon dioxide in arterial blood. When you hyperventilate, PaCO2 levels decrease, which means there's less CO2 in the alveoli, the tiny air sacs in the lungs responsible for gas exchange. This decrease can have significant effects on blood chemistry and overall acid-base balance. Ventilation plays a crucial role here because it helps regulate PaCO2 and, consequently, influences volatile acids like carbonic acid. When ventilation increases, it effectively removes more CO2 from the blood, which in turn impacts the blood's acid-base status. You can think of this increased effort in breathing as the ventilatory effort. Basically, your respiratory system is working harder to eliminate the excess CO2. This increased effort results in a greater ventilatory work, which is important to understand because it shows how the body responds to and compensates for changes in acid-base balance. As a result of this enhanced ventilatory effort and the reduction in PaCO2, blood acid levels decrease. This causes the blood pH to rise, leading to a state of respiratory alkalosis. So, in summary, hyperventilation causes a decrease in PaCO2, increases ventilatory effort, and raises blood pH by lowering acid levels. Understanding this process helps us see how breathing patterns directly influence our body's acid-base balance. Now, let's talk about how oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported in the blood, which is a crucial part of respiratory gas exchange. Oxygen, or O2, is mainly carried in two ways. First, it binds to hemoglobin inside red blood cells, which allows for efficient transport. Second, a small amount dissolves directly in the plasma. This dual method ensures oxygen is effectively delivered to tissues. When it comes to carbon dioxide, or CO2, its transport is a bit more complex. It can be dissolved directly in the plasma, bound chemically to hemoglobin, or most commonly, converted into bicarbonate ions in the plasma. Hemoglobin plays a vital role here too, helping in the exchange of gases in both the lungs and tissues. Most of the CO2 in the blood is actually carried as bicarbonate ions, which form through a reaction catalyzed by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. This process is essential for maintaining acid-base balance and efficient gas transport. Gas exchange occurs primarily in the alveoli of the lungs. Here, oxygen from the inhaled air is taken up by the blood, while carbon dioxide is released from the blood to be exhaled. This exchange is the core function that keeps our tissues supplied with oxygen and removes waste CO2. Understanding these mechanisms highlights just how interconnected and efficient our respiratory system really is, supporting the overall theme of how vital respiratory gases are for our body's function. Now, let's look at the different ways carbon dioxide is transported in the blood. CO2 is carried in three main forms, and the most significant one involves hemoglobin, or HB. As CO2 diffuses out of the tissues, it enters the bloodstream and binds to hemoglobin, forming carbaminohemoglobin. This is an important mechanism because it helps remove CO2 efficiently from the tissues where it's produced. In addition to hemoglobin, CO2 is transported as bicarbonate, or HCO3, which is the primary form in plasma. When CO2 enters the blood, it reacts with water to form bicarbonate ions, which are then dissolved in the plasma. This process is vital because it allows the blood to carry a large amount of CO2 without changing the pH balance significantly. So, in summary, CO2 is transported mainly in three ways: bound to hemoglobin, as bicarbonate ions in plasma, and in a small amount dissolved directly in the plasma. Understanding these forms helps us see how efficiently our respiratory system manages gas exchange and maintains homeostasis. Now, let's talk about how blood carries carbon dioxide, specifically through plasma. A small but important part of CO2 is dissolved directly in the plasma, roughly 10% of the total CO2 transported. When we look at venous blood, the amount of dissolved CO2 is about 3 milliliters per deciliter. This might seem like a small amount, but it plays a crucial role in the overall process of gas exchange. This dissolved CO2 in plasma is one of the ways CO2 is transported from tissues back to the lungs for exhalation. Understanding this helps us see the complexity of respiratory gas transport and how different mechanisms work together to maintain proper blood gas levels. Let's take a closer look at how blood carries carbon dioxide, or CO2, which is a crucial part of our respiratory process. Most of the CO2 in the blood, about 90%, actually enters red blood cells, or RBCs. This is a key point because it shows that the majority of CO2 is processed right where the red blood cells are. Now, when we talk about how CO2 is transported, one important method is through a molecule called bicarbonate, or HCO3. About 70% of CO2 is carried in this form, which means that the bicarbonate ion plays a major role in removing CO2 from the tissues to the lungs. In addition to bicarbonate, around 20% of CO2 binds directly to hemoglobin, the same protein that carries oxygen. Hemoglobin doesn't just carry oxygen, it also helps transport CO2 back to the lungs by binding to it. So to summarize, most CO2, around 90%, enters the red blood cells. Of that, a significant part is transported as bicarbonate, about 70%, and a smaller but important portion, about 20%, is carried attached to hemoglobin. These mechanisms work together seamlessly to ensure efficient gas exchange and maintain our body's pH balance. Now let's look at how blood carries carbon dioxide, or CO2, in the form of bicarbonate, HCO3. First, CO2 combines with water to form carbonic acid, H2CO3. This is a crucial step because it starts the process of transporting CO2 from tissues to the lungs. Next, the role of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase comes into play. This enzyme acts as a catalyst, meaning it speeds up the reaction. Specifically, it makes the conversion of CO2 and water into carbonic acid happen about 13,000 times faster inside red blood cells compared to plasma. This acceleration is vital for efficient gas exchange. Then, the carbonic acid dissociates into bicarbonate ions, HCO3, and hydrogen ions, H+. This dissociation allows CO2 to be effectively converted into a form that can be transported through the bloodstream. Most of the CO2 is carried in the blood as bicarbonate, which is dissolved in plasma. This form is stable and easily transported to the lungs for removal. Finally, to maintain electrical neutrality during this process, the chloride shift, also known as the Hamburger phenomenon, occurs. This involves the exchange of bicarbonate ions out of the red blood cells with chloride ions in. This exchange is essential for balancing the charge and ensuring continuous CO2 transport. By understanding this process, we see how the body efficiently manages CO2 removal, which is a key part of respiratory gas exchange and overall homeostasis. Now, let's talk about how carbon dioxide, or CO2, is transported in the blood, specifically when it binds to hemoglobin. About 20% of the CO2 in our blood is carried in this way, forming what we call a carbamino compound. This is an important part of how our body efficiently removes CO2 from tissues and delivers it to the lungs for exhalation. The formation of this compound, known as carbaminohemoglobin or HbCO2, occurs through a simple reaction. Hemoglobin binds with CO2 to form HbCO2. This process is reversible, meaning CO2 can attach and detach as needed, depending on the concentration in different parts of the body. Now, you might wonder, how does this affect oxygen transport? Well, interestingly, the transport of CO2 by hemoglobin doesn't interfere with O2 transport at all. This is because CO2 binds to a different part of the hemoglobin molecule, the globin protein, so both gases can be carried simultaneously without competing for the same sites. In summary, the way hemoglobin handles CO2 is crucial for maintaining efficient gas exchange. It allows the blood to carry carbon dioxide away from tissues without disrupting oxygen delivery, which is essential for our overall respiratory function. Now let's look at how blood carries CO2, focusing on the role of hemoglobin. First, in the tissues, CO2 is produced as a waste product of cellular respiration. This CO2 then diffuses out of the cells and into the bloodstream. The next step involves hemoglobin in the red blood cells, which binds to this CO2. When it binds, it forms a compound called carbaminohemoglobin, which is how CO2 gets transported through the blood. Finally, when the blood reaches the lungs, CO2 is released from the hemoglobin. This CO2 is then expelled from the body during exhalation. This process is crucial because it helps maintain the body's acid-base balance and ensures efficient gas exchange. It's a perfect example of how our respiratory and circulatory systems work together seamlessly. Now let's look at how blood carries carbon dioxide, or CO2, specifically through hemoglobin. When CO2 is produced in the tissues, it needs to be transported efficiently to the lungs for exhalation. So, CO2 moves from the tissues into the blood, a process driven by concentration gradients. Once it reaches the lungs, all the reactions involving CO2 are reversed. This means that bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions recombine to form carbonic acid, which then quickly breaks down into CO2 and water. This reversal is crucial because it allows CO2 to be released from the blood into the alveoli for exhalation. A key mechanism in this process is the chloride shift. When bicarbonate ions enter the red blood cell, chloride ions exit in exchange. This exchange helps maintain the electrical neutrality and assists in the transport of CO2. Finally, CO2 diffuses out of the blood into the alveoli. This occurs because of the partial pressure gradient. There's a higher concentration of CO2 in the blood than in the alveoli, so CO2 naturally moves out to be expelled during breathing. All of these steps work together seamlessly, ensuring efficient gas exchange and proper respiratory function. Now, let's explore the Haldane effect. This concept highlights how there's a mutually enhancing interaction between oxygen and carbon dioxide transport in our blood. Essentially, when oxygen binds to hemoglobin, it actually makes it easier for carbon dioxide to be carried away from tissues. Conversely, the Haldane effect also means that in regions where oxygen levels are low, hemoglobin has a greater capacity to pick up carbon dioxide. Next, we have the Boer effect, which is closely related. It describes how increased carbon dioxide levels and lower pH cause hemoglobin to release oxygen more readily. So, in active tissues where CO2 is high, oxygen is released more efficiently. Together, these effects, Haldane and Boer, demonstrate a beautiful dynamic balance. They show how oxygen and carbon dioxide transport are interconnected, enhancing each other's efficiency depending on the body's needs. This interaction is fundamental to our respiratory gas exchange, ensuring that oxygen delivery and CO2 removal are optimized during various physiological states. Now, let's take a closer look at how carbon dioxide impacts hemoglobin's ability to carry oxygen. When CO2 binds to hemoglobin, it actually decreases hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. This means hemoglobin is less likely to hold onto oxygen once CO2 is attached. This process is a key part of how our body efficiently unloads oxygen in tissues that need it most. This phenomenon is known as the Bower effect. It's a vital concept because it shows how changes in CO2 levels can directly influence oxygen delivery. When CO2 levels rise, such as during exercise or in active tissues, hemoglobin releases oxygen more readily. This adaptive response helps ensure that oxygen gets where it's needed most, exemplifying the dynamic nature of our respiratory system. So, in essence, the Bower effect highlights the important relationship between carbon dioxide and oxygen transport, reinforcing the overall theme of how our body manages gas exchange efficiently under different conditions. Now, let's talk about how oxygen release actually works in our bodies. The key idea here is that the more carbon dioxide, or CO2, that's produced in the muscles, the more oxygen, or O2, will be released into those muscles to support activity. This is a crucial part of how our body adapts to increased demands during exercise or muscle work. So, when your muscles are working harder, naturally, they produce more CO2 as a byproduct of energy production. And this increased CO2 level actually signals your blood to release more oxygen where it's needed most. This process is closely related to what we call the Bower effect. The Bower effect explains how an increase in CO2 and the resulting decrease in pH cause hemoglobin to release oxygen more readily. So, essentially, the more active your muscles are, the more CO2 they generate, and the more oxygen your blood will deliver to support that activity. In short, this mechanism ensures that oxygen is efficiently supplied during times of increased muscle activity, helping us perform better and recover faster. It's a perfect example of how tightly regulated and responsive our respiratory system truly is. Now, let's explore how gas exchange and respiratory gas transport are interconnected, especially when it comes to CO2 binding. When oxygen is unloaded from hemoglobin, it actually makes room for more CO2 to bind. This is a key point because it shows how hemoglobin can adapt to different needs during respiration. As oxygen leaves hemoglobin, the affinity of hemoglobin for CO2 increases. In other words, hemoglobin becomes more eager to pick up CO2. This process is part of what's known as the Haldane effect, which helps explain how our bodies efficiently manage CO2 removal. Essentially, the removal of oxygen from hemoglobin enhances its ability to bind with CO2, facilitating the transport of CO2 from tissues back to the lungs for exhalation. This dynamic interaction highlights the intricate balance in our respiratory system, where oxygen unloading and CO2 binding are closely linked to ensure effective gas exchange. Understanding this connection is crucial because it emphasizes how our respiratory system adapts to different conditions, ensuring that oxygen delivery and CO2 removal happens smoothly, supporting overall homeostasis. Let's explore how hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen and carbon dioxide changes during gas exchange. First, we have the Bower effect, which describes how an increase in carbon dioxide or a decrease in pH reduces hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. This means that in active tissues, where CO2 levels are higher and pH is lower, hemoglobin releases oxygen more readily to support metabolism. Next, there's the Haldane effect, which is essentially the opposite process. When oxygen binds to hemoglobin in the lungs, it causes hemoglobin to release carbon dioxide more easily. Conversely, in tissues, as oxygen unloads, hemoglobin's capacity to carry CO2 increases, facilitating its transport back to the lungs. Now, these two effects, Bower and Haldane, highlight a fascinating interaction between oxygen and carbon dioxide transport. They work together in a mutually enhancing way. As oxygen is released in tissues, CO2 is picked up, and when oxygen binds in the lungs, CO2 is offloaded. This complementary interaction ensures efficient gas exchange, optimizing how our body manages oxygen delivery and carbon dioxide removal during respiration. Let's delve into slide 24, which covers gas exchange and respiratory gas transport. Understanding the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system is essential for providing effective respiratory care. The Bower effect is a key concept here. It highlights how increased CO2 levels in the blood promote the release of oxygen from hemoglobin, making oxygen more available to tissues that need it most. Gas exchange processes are influenced by several factors, including CO2 concentration and how hemoglobin functions. When oxygen is inhaled, it moves from the alveolar air spaces into the blood, while carbon dioxide, a waste product, moves from the blood into the alveolar spaces to be exhaled. This exchange is vital for maintaining proper respiratory function and overall homeostasis. Focusing on the lungs, CO2 is transported in a few different ways. It can be carried in red blood cells or dissolved directly in plasma. Interestingly, CO2 reacts with water to form carbonic acid, which then dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. This process is facilitated by the chloride shift, which helps move bicarbonate ions in and out of red blood cells, maintaining acid-base balance. Moving to peripheral tissues, oxygen diffuses from the blood into tissue cells, while CO2 diffuses out of tissues into the blood. The partial pressure of oxygen in these tissues is about 46 mHg. The Bower effect again plays a role here. When CO2 levels rise, it promotes the release of more oxygen from hemoglobin, ensuring tissues receive enough oxygen during increased activity. In the circulatory system, blood plays a crucial role in gas transport. Hemoglobin binds with oxygen for delivery to tissues and also forms carbaminohemoglobin when it binds with CO2 additionally. Hydrogen ions from carbonic acid bind to hemoglobin, helping buffer blood pH during gas exchange. To summarize, hemoglobin is central to gas transport. It not only carries oxygen, but also plays a vital role in removing CO2 and managing blood pH. This intricate process ensures that oxygen reaches tissues efficiently and that waste gases are expelled effectively, supporting overall respiratory health and function.